So I'd like to, get us started. My name is Joe Knippenberg. I'm a professor of politics here at Oglethorpe. And I'd like to welcome you to this year's commemoration of Constitution Day, featuring a keynote speaker, Dr. James Stoner of LSU, and three respondents, Dr. Daniel Cullen of Rhodes College, Dr. Clark Schmerer of Oglethorpe, and Dr. Devon Belcher of Oglethorpe. Format will be Dr. Stoner speaking for 40 to 45 minutes and then very brief responses from respondents. A brief time for questions here, and then more importantly, more conversation afterwards over wine and cheese. And I told the respondents they're the only thing standing between you and the wine and the cheese, so they promised to keep their remarks relatively brief. Let me begin the event by thanking the sponsors of the event. And there are three. There's the Jack Miller Center for Teaching America's Founding Principles in History. There's the Institute for Humane Studies, and there's the John Templeton Foundation. We're grateful to all three of them for supporting events like this all over the country. The focus today is on freedom of speech, and I promise you that Dr. Stoner will have a very nice set of remarks on the subject. I told him in a variety of ways that he was a very appropriate speaker for this venue, and one of my captive audiences is my constitutional law class. Now, it turns out I'm teaching a small constitutional law class this semester with 6 students, all of whom are left-handed. Dr. Stoner is left-handed. So, this is, how shall I say, a leftish approach to freedom of speech. Now, let me say a few words about Dr. Stoner, who I've known for a long time, and who's actually spoken on the Oglethorpe campus once before, about a decade ago. Dr. Stoner received his bachelor's degree from Libertarianism College, his PhD from Harvard University. He also went to high school with my best man, and was my best man's TA at Harvard. Which is not called TA, right? They're teaching fellows, whatever. He is the Herman Moyes Junior Professor of Political Science and Director of the Eric Berglund Institute at LSU, where he has taught since 1988, is that right? Author of 2 books, Common Law Liberty, Rethinking American Constitutionalism, and Common Law and Liberal Theory, Cook, Hobbes, and the Origins of American Constitutionalism, editor of several other books, author just today of a very thought-provoking and stimulating essay on Madisonian originalism on the Library of Law and Liberty site. He has served at LSU's department chair as acting dean of the Honors College. He was a member of the National Council for Humanities from 2002 to 2006. Now, I'm going to go ahead and briefly introduce the commentators as well, so I don't interrupt the proceedings anymore. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Stoner. Three discussants, 2 of whom should be fairly well known to you, or at least one of whom is fairly well known to you, if not notorious, and it's Dr. Devon Belcher. Like Dr. Stoner, he's an alumnus of a college that's been in the news recently. In his case, it's Reed College in Portland. His PhD is in philosophy from the University of Colorado. He's been at Oglethorpe, I don't know how long, a long time.
Almost 10 years now.
Almost 10 years. Seems longer.
Seems longer.
Which is to say, he's a very large presence on campus, and much appreciated and beloved by his students. At the other end of the Oglethorpe extreme is Dr. Clark Schmerer, who is brand new to Oglethorpe. He's been here about 3 weeks now, maybe 4 weeks. A month. Okay. Seems long. Dr. Schmerer is a graduate of Bowdoin College and received her PhD from Boston College. She has had postdoctoral and teaching positions at the University of Richmond, at Emory University, and at the University of New Hampshire. We are fortunate to have her here this year to teach in the core and to teach upper division classes in politics. And last but not least, Dr. Daniel Cullen, who received his bachelor's degree from Yale University, his master's from Dalhousie University. So we've internationalized the program now, and his PhD from Boston College. He's a professor of political science at Rhodes College in Memphis, which has nice Gothic architecture as well. He's the author of Freedom in Rousseau's Political Philosophy, editor of Liberal Education and Liberal Democracy, fellow member with me of the board of the Association for Cortex and Courses, and most importantly for our purposes here, he is the Jack Miller Center's Senior Fellow for Constitutional Studies, which is to say, for the Jack Miller Center, one of our funders, he is Mr. Constitution Day. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming all our commentators.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be back at Oglethorpe. And I promised Joe I wouldn't tell any stories about what we used to do when we were assistant professors hanging around classes. So they would be very boring. The title of my talk is The Positive Liberty of Speech. In a much noted essay written in the middle of the 20th century, after the devastation of two horrible world wars, the British philosopher and historian of ideas, Isaiah Berlin, drew a distinction between what he called two concepts of liberty, one positive and one negative. Now, you might think that the positive would be good and the negative bad, but Berlin was a liberal skeptic and given to irony, so he reversed the valences. Negative liberty, by which he meant freedom from government interference, was the form of liberty that he praised in the essay. Positive liberty, by contrast, was the bad, or at any rate dangerous idea. In its name, that is, in the name of freeing men from past oppression, the totalitarian states of the 20th century had their origin, both fascist and communist, states that in practice oppressed men in the name of freeing them, or murdered them in the name of freeing others they allegedly oppressed. Without digging too deeply into Berlin's difficult essay right now, applying this distinction to freedom of speech would yield a contrast between a negative freedom of speech, the freedom from government interference with speech, or maybe government protection for speech from various viewpoints and with unregulated content, the kind of free speech our Constitution is currently thought to protect, and which Berlin would presumably value or endorse. Between that and positive freedom of speech, what would the latter be? That's where I want to start. The most accessible and perhaps most honest presentation of what Berlin warns against as positive liberty on the issue of free speech is Herbert Marcuse's 1965 essay, Repressive Tolerance. Marcuse's argument is that the tolerance of all viewpoints and expression of all opinions privileges the status quo. Moreover, the individuals who speak have, without their necessarily being aware of it, they've had their words formed, or their minds formed by the dominant society, which he describes as militaristic, capitalistic, and oppressive. And thus, they're incapable of genuine democracy or freedom. Allowing both sides to speak in such circumstances is really giving all the effective speech to one side, he argues. Quote, the antagonistic structure of society rigs the rules of the game, promising progress towards a humane, non-oppressive democracy as the objective truth of social relations, a Marxist trope, though without Marxist confidence in a revolutionary working class who've been corrupted, but instead in academic intellectuals like himself. Marcuse advocates toleration of radical progressives, but not of conservatives. He writes, suppression of regressive policies, opinions, and movements is a prerequisite for the strengthening of progressive ones. And then he would say, nip them in the bud. Quote, withdrawal of toleration from regressive movements before they become active is what he advocates. To be sure, he says, this is censorship, even pre-censorship, but openly directed against the more or less hidden censorship that pervades the free media, the so-called free media. The conditions under which tolerance can again become a liberating and harmonizing force, he writes, have still to be created. And as if reading from Berlin's script, he adds, quote, freedom is still to be created even for the freest of the existing societies. True freedom, in other words, will only come about if what we call freedom is lost. Marcuse has the virtue of frankness, but he wrote before the emergence of modern identity politics, something that he endorses in a way before the fact in his praise of Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. Contemporary advocates of positive liberty are usually less frank about the need to repress liberal freedom, but they're anodyne-sounding alternatives. For example, the, quote, democratic speech environment praised in a recent posting by the Association of American Colleges and Universities that Dr. Cullen brought to my attention. These follow the same logic, though the ultimate appeal is not to truths of historical necessity, but sympathy for past disadvantage or guilt over past privilege. These are said to be, quote, sites of justice-seeking conversation and discourse, a noble-sounding aspiration, if it includes, as was said to have happened one night at Cephalus's house in the Piraeus a couple millennia ago, the question of what justice is. But it's clear enough that that question is no longer on the table, or rather, everyone knows, because everyone knows the answer in their minds. Quote, American higher education is protected, a silent power that is based on racial, class, and gender privilege, and compounded by institutional inertia, with the consequence that students aren't ready for a curriculum of, here's their choice of core texts, Foucault, Audre Lorde, and W.E.B. Du Bois, until they have overcome the baggage of, quote, racial, class, and gender antagonisms. Now, my point is not that these authors aren't worth reading. The two that I know certainly are. Nor that it sometimes takes preparation for students to be able to understand difficult works. Only that indoctrination in dominant opinion is what I thought students were supposed to leave behind by going to college, where they can encounter the full range and depth of human thought. But that's not the way it appears in this report. In fact, I forgot to put into my speech the quotation, the long quotation, so I'll spare it from you. I'll just give you the translation. Shut up and tell us what we want to hear. That's what I think they're telling professors. Or as the students at Middlebury College, my alma mater, as you heard, wrote in defense of shouting down a major speaker, Charles Murray, who had come to their campus to be interviewed by a liberal professor whom they injured in a ruckus afterwards. Quote, if racist stuff, that's not what they wrote, if racist stuff comes up, rational debate cannot dismantle it or effectively combat its growing power. The idea, still quoting, that bigotry will collapse under academia's expression that were once thought unprotected, academic expression, let me read that. If racist stuff comes up, rational debate cannot dismantle it or effectively combat its growing power. The idea that bigotry will collapse under academia's enlightened rationality is false. We must name it and deprive it of power. Well, how would they know what would come up when they didn't allow the speaker to speak? And how would they know that reason was powerless if they wouldn't give it a chance? Next to Marcuse and his contemporary epigones, the Supreme Court's law of free speech, a sort of libertarian doctrine, or negative liberty, as Berlin says, seems, I think, to be a welcome contrast. The development of free speech libertarianism, this negative liberty of speech, was a project of the court in the 20th century, beginning haltingly, but developing boldly since the 1960s, so that now it counts among its champions many of the reputed conservatives of the court. The old law of free speech, constitutional and common law, drew a sharp line between speech and action, protecting only the former under freedom of speech and press, and limiting protection even of those to speech and writings that did not have a tendency to lead to illegal deeds. The key opinion in the change was Justice Brandeis's concurrence in the case of Whitney v. California in 1927 that suggested the standard adopted by the whole court 40 years later, that speech should be protected unless there is advocacy of violence and imminent danger that it would occur. Meanwhile, though the standard was developed specifically to deal with political speech, other kinds of expression that were once thought unprotected, libel, obscenity, commercial speech, and fighting words or nasty epithets, these have increasingly been given court protection by severely narrowing the unprotected zones. Libel no longer requires evidence of truth told with good motives for a claim to be quashed. At least public figures can be defamed unless they can show that the speaker said something that he knew was false or showed reckless disregard for the truth. Obscenity now applies only to hardcore pornography, rather than anything tending to appeal to the prurient interest. Though, to be fair, society seems not inclined to prosecute even this unless children are involved. Commercial speech now can sometimes be can only sometimes be regulated. Fighting words can only be punished if they're forbidden equally on both sides. And symbolic expression, from T-shirts with obscenities to flag burning, now count by the court as speech. In a recent case, the Supreme Court upheld, with all the rhetoric of constitutional freedom, the right of the so-called Westboro Baptist Church to denounce the military, the country, homosexuals, and the Catholic Church near the Catholic funeral of a fallen soldier. The internet is notoriously a place for unrestrained insult, thanks in part to the court's striking down early attempts to regulate obscenity on it. Or at least it's a place for that, except when popular outcry leads popular websites to censor selectively the enemy of the day. Frankly, I find both positive and negative liberty of the positive and the negative liberty of speech as now practiced to be inadequate. I consider myself a friend of free speech, however, but I want to take the position that there are legitimate limits on free speech, beyond what the courts now recognize and enforce. And I take this position precisely for the sake of freedom of speech, to make it attractive to good men and women who believe in honesty, courage, justice, civility, and other virtues, as well as in love and in friendship and family and property and civil society and many other good things that we seek or enjoy in this life. Freedom of speech, I think, must again be distinguished from licentious speech, although today the distinction is largely lost. Our current crisis in free speech, I think, comes about in part from our failure to understand what free speech is or ought to be, and from haphazard attempts to strike back at the excesses of licentious speech, which damage indiscriminately the good and the nefarious. To bring order to our thinking, I want to suggest 3 ends or purposes of free speech, and then relate to each end the limits on free speech that are inherent in the purpose. The ends overlap, as you'll see, and so do the norms that ought to govern free speech in their context. But let me start with that distinction nonetheless. The first purpose of free speech, presented in the classic Defenses of Free Speech by John Milton and John Stuart Mill, is that freedom of speech is essential if human beings are to learn and know the truth. By this, they mean the truth about all things, addressing great and perennial questions about the nature of the universe, about human flourishing, about God, about justice, about danger and risk, as well as more particular truths about day-to-day life, such as about the character of those in authority, or the guilt of someone accused of a crime. Famously or notoriously, human opinions about all of these things differ, sometimes dramatically. And these opinions are not only the idle speculations of an evening by the fire or an hour on the internet, but form the basis for organizing societies and conducting their affairs. Naturally enough, in the midst of action based on one's opinions, one rarely has either the time or the inclination to listen to its opposite. But we praise freedom of speech because it reminds us that we human beings are not omniscient and may be mistaken in what we say and do. That there is another side to most positions that we take, and that having the courage to raise objections and the wisdom to listen to them when raised by others is a mark of intelligence and prudence. Philosophy proceeds dialectically. This has been known at least since Socrates. And science proceeds through the rigorous comparison of hypothesis and results. Trials in court depend on an adversarial system in which advocates of both sides of a dispute take turns. Public debates thrive on the lively presentation of partisan opinions. All of this is not because we assume that there is no truth to be uncovered, that everything is just a matter of perspective, but because the way to truth is through critical engagement, or at least that that is required to test the truth of a proposition, however it might have been initially conceived. If getting at the truth is the first purpose of free speech, a limit on speaking emerges directly from it. Namely, it's wrong to lie, that is, to say an untruth deliberately. Of course, if truth were easy to grasp, untruths would be easy to detect, and neither is the case. All the time, people make false statements, thinking that they're true. And the history, even of philosophy and science, not to mention of politics or of love, is filled with error. Error in itself may have no rights, but the friend of free speech allows ample latitude for the sincere, if mistaken, expression of belief. Still, this is a matter of prudence rather than fun, I think, for generally no one has a right to tell a deliberate falsehood, as though it were authentic truth. The law cannot punish all lying, at least not without doubling the number of lies. You lie, says the accuser. No, I don't, replies the liar. But in some circumstances, for example, lying under oath in court, the law does indeed step in. We don't expect the law to adjudicate untruth in philosophy or in science. But here too, making due allowance for matters of uncertainty, we do insist on academic honesty, which a claim of academic freedom cannot override. In short, we tolerate a lot of error when we allow freedom of speech, but error's only claim to respect comes from its ability to point us towards what's true. A second purpose of free speech is to allow for self-government. So first purpose, to find the truth. Second purpose, self-government. A monarch or a small junta might be able to rule without public speaking. But in a republic or a democracy, deliberation takes place openly. And every citizen knows that to make a good choice, you ought to hear both sides in any debate. What I said before about getting at the truth applies as well to discerning what is good. It's important to hear arguments for and against any public action. Indeed, to hear all sorts of views about what ought to be on the public agenda. Corresponding to this purpose, the next inherent limit on speech comes from the need for rules of order in political debate, which restrict speech in small particulars in order to forward speech as a whole. Even our program this afternoon, for example, though academic rather than political, is highly structured, with my giving a lecture to start, then getting responses from the panelists, then opening the floor to questions. A better conversation about these things might be more Socratic, and maybe we can do that over the wine. Back and forth as the argument leads. But our host wants to make sure in a public setting with a substantial audience that one position is heard and criticized, and then that you have a chance to subject it to further scrutiny. Different settings commend different rules, some for the legislative chamber, others for college lecture hall, others for the courtroom, still others for a public forum or the public streets. Without rules of order, speech is often just noise, expressing passion perhaps, but not offering reasons, staking out positions, but not aiming at understanding. There is a place for passion, for positioning, even for protest in self-government, maybe even in the academy. But it's only provisional or initial, I think. The beginning point of an argument, bringing something neglected to the attention of the complacent. If it persists and does not take the next step towards genuine engagement, following the rules of some forum, it's more likely to suppress speech than to promote it. This, I might add parenthetically, is the cause of many speech controversies on university campuses these days, like the one I mentioned before. And I recommend to you a new report by the Goldwater Institute that proposes model legislation to protect genuine free speech on campuses against shouting down by various mobs. There's a third end or purpose of free speech, and maybe this should especially be called free expression rather than just free speech. And that would be the freedom of the individual, by himself or herself, or in association with others, to express one's individuality and to make a distinctive contribution to society, whether to culture, to the economy, or simply to his neighbors and friends. Timothy Garton Ash, in his important and comprehensive recent book, Free Speech, 10 Principles for a Connected World, places this purpose first, at least as regards individuals, and then adds as a fourth purpose the expression of diversity in groups. But I find it more accurate historically and more sound anthropologically to begin with the purposes of truth-seeking and Republican governance, and then to add the distinctively modern aim of self-development. Here I want to note 4 limits. First, speech can sometimes threaten or assault another person. And in such a situation, I think it has no rights to claim protection as freedom of speech. I have in mind, for example, a white person's disdainfully calling an African American by the N-word to his face. And there are other examples, even in our crude age, where you might agree that a person struck with an epithet ought to be able to reply as he would to a punch, following the Supreme Court's old doctrine of fighting words. I don't mean here to endorse a general power to take offense at other statements, much less complaints that shut down academic or political debate of sensitive topics that touch close to people's sense of themselves and what really matters. For instance, on topics of race and ethnicity, of sexuality or religion. Still, sensible people can distinguish between expression of a general opinion, which might well be based in prejudice, the airing of which freedom of speech would permit, and saying something for no purpose other than to be threatening or cruel. Frankly, I'd be happy to ban the N-word and the F-word from campus, their use perhaps to be punished with a fine. Especially the latter might give students, not to mention faculty, an incentive to develop their vocabularies, learn to express their complaints with precision and even wit. The second legitimate limit on free speech, for the sake of justice, concerns speech that does real, often measurable harm. Here I have in mind defamatory speech, slander or libel, that falsely attributes to others some fault or wrong that damages or destroys their reputation. If a usually credible source falsely accuses a restaurant of harboring rats on their kitchen services or serving them in the soup, it can destroy the owner's livelihood and that of his chef and staff. Falsely accusing an athlete of cheating can ruin his career, not to mention his lucrative endorsements. Falsely accusing an author of plagiarism likewise brings ruin, and so forth through all the trades and professions. Not even to mention the reputation for chastity or virtue among those who care about such things. Into this category of causing harm by speech belongs fraudulent speech in sales and contracts, which the law rightly punishes and sometimes guards against. Of course, here too, as in the case of the pursuit of truth generally, we rightly want to allow speech some latitude, and custom and informal opinion might often be a better regulator than coercive law. Even the law rightly allows ample room for comment on public figures. For them to collect libel, as I said, they must show actual malice on the part of their defamers. And there was always a provision for fair comment even before the New York Times v. Sullivan case. And as customers, we learn not to take too seriously claims about, quote, the greatest show on earth, or, quote, new and improved. Still, libel and fraud are serious matters that can do serious injustice by speech alone. A third sort of injustice involves speech or expression that insinuates evil into its hearers or watchers unawares, or maybe with their invitation, but with effects on third parties that are seriously unjust. I have in mind, for example, pornography, particularly insofar as it's available to the young or unsuspected, or available in its more extreme versions to the weak who lack self-control. I think the evidence is actually pretty clear, and better explained than ever through modern neuroscience, that pornography can be addictive and do damage to people's sexual health, affecting and sometimes destroying their marriages or crippling their ability to form healthy relationships. Likewise, I think that obscenely violent video games will be discovered to have similar effects on people's character, again, particularly the young, and that it was irresponsible of the Supreme Court to discard on free speech principles a California statute the other year that sought to restrict their sale to minors. Naturally, the question of what the law can achieve regarding any potentially addictive substance is a complex one. And while I doubt that any good use of such materials is possible, I realize there are those who think there is, and that in the context of widespread disagreement, it might be prudent to minimize restriction and leave the matter to private choice. Still, my point here is that, at least in principle, freedom of speech ought not to be invoked to defend expression that undermines the psychological prerequisites for freedom of thought and action, and the moral character of free souls. Finally, freedom of speech finds a limit in the imperative to protect individual privacy. There are things about us that no one, or at any rate not just anyone, has a right to know, and if they're learned, that no one has a right to broadcast. The modern self needs to protect its privacy every bit as much as it needs to express itself publicly. I suppose that if men were angels or philosophers, as James Madison said, this would not be a consideration. We could all live with the whole truth about ourselves being known by others, and we would not judge others harshly for their weaknesses or their flaws. But because we're flawed beings, the theological term is sinners, we could not preserve our dignity around one another if we could not keep certain things from public view. For example, our medical history or childhood foibles, not to mention our private thoughts or unguarded slips of the tongue. Naturally, there are times when privacy might be compromised by other imperatives. It's often thought that people who stand for office sacrifice some privacy, as voters might claim a right to know about their health or their personal history, about their failings or their wealth. Still, in a free society, I think we often respect individual privacy beyond what strict justice might demand, perhaps for the sake of giving someone a second chance in life, a fresh beginning, and that's a good thing. Privacy admits that there are certain truths that everyone does not have a right to know. So these are the limits I would note on free speech, or rather on licentious speech, for the sake of true freedom of speech. The limits demanded by the search for truth against the right to lie and to interrupt or shout down, the limits required for self-government against disorder and disruption, and the limits demanded by justice for individuals against assault, against libel and fraud, against insinuating evil, and against invasion of privacy. Taken together, I think they would help us become a little better than we are. Now, in this last part of my talk, I want to turn to the positive reasons that freedom of speech and vigorous debate ought to be encouraged. This is not Berlin's positive liberty, but I do want to say something positive about freedom of speech and positive action that needs to be taken in order to secure it, or to secure the true ends for which it is praised. Our crisis in free speech today is not only that we sometimes allow speech that is undeserving of protection, or fail to protect speech that is deserving, but that we fail to summon and encourage the speech that we really need. This is true, I think, both in civic life and in the university, and the failings of each are bleeding into each other. In civic life, the fever pitch of partisan rancor is such that it appears to be difficult for Republicans and Democrats to speak productively with one another, even across the aisle in legislative chambers, where individuals have known one another for years. We hear repeatedly on one side that the president has poisoned debate, littering the airwaves and cyberspace with false facts and a culture of bullying and insult, not least by his use of social media, even after assuming office. On the other side, it seems clear that Mr. Trump was elevated as a spokesman precisely in response to a false propriety that pervades its own opinion as orthodoxy, whether in the account of contemporary events or in its establishment of a new morality that dismisses traditional notions of right and wrong, goodness and badness, even beauty and ugliness, as hopelessly unenlightened, and denounces those who hold these traditional notions as bigots. Here it's not exactly that each side does not know what the other thinks. Indeed, each side is confident that it's heard more than enough from the other. But I think each side would be hard-pressed to explain how any sensible person can see things differently than it does. And that, I think, might be the key to making progress towards restoring a civil conversation. If each side would try honestly to see how the other sees things, what he or she fears, hopes, knows, and believes, not supposing at the outset that their opponents are simply deluded or irrational, but that they might just have a point. This means that the Trump supporter ought to consider what it's like for Hispanic Americans or Native Americans to hear about building a wall on the southern border. Not the one who is here illegally, although one's sympathy might extend to them too, but just someone of Mexican or Central American descent who holds a green card or is even a citizen. What is it like for an African American who feels he's not only lost a friendly and understanding compatriot in the White House, but that mindset has been repudiated and replaced with its hostile opposite? What of the Muslim American who sees in the president's travel ban not the purported measure to protect against terrorism, but an insult against his faith and a repudiation by his fellow citizens? What of the liberal progressive, whose whole understanding of the arc of history has been disrupted and whose favored policies are not only suspended, but starting to be reversed? On the other side, however, can the liberal understand the Christian who sees the social agenda pushed upon the country by liberal professors, the liberal media, the federal bureaucracy, and the federal courts, often without allowing him his democratic right to vote, or to have his vote matter on these matters, who sees this as an assault upon all that's right and good and pure, whose communities are increasingly forbidden from publicly affirming shared beliefs and promoting them by law, where they cannot form the common culture that promotes trust and enables friendship? What of those who, through no fault of their own, are not members of minorities singled out for special advantages by affirmative action? Some perhaps even members of ethnic and religious minorities themselves, who've worked hard for their success and are now told they don't deserve their rewards? What more generally of the law-abiding and the thick-skinned, who do their duty as they see it without complaint, when they seem to see all public benefits go to those who shirk and shriek? And what of those who, in a time of economic insecurity and increasing inequality, lurch between demanding opportunity to work and earn and demanding government protection and munificence for the needs that they cannot meet on their own? That troubled working class that determines elections these days according to which way they lean. I've tried to express these viewpoints sympathetically on both sides. And if you thought I favored one or the other, either I failed in my intention, or perhaps you heard through partisan ears. I don't fault you for that if it's so, but only suggest that trying to figure out what others' interests and opinions and even passions are is the beginning of mutual understanding, which makes it possible, politically, to work together where those interests and opinions overlap, and not allow differences, even on deeply important matters, to blind us to the interests that we share. Part of the genius of our federal system is that we are called to address our common interests on different levels, where many distinctions lose their relevance, and where immediate common concerns are evident to all. My point about free speech in the civic realm is not that it's absent right now, or even inhibited, but that there's a dearth of listening, probably on both sides, to one another. Yes, failure to listen can be promoted by politicians who seek electoral advantage by appealing to the most active and often most extreme among their fellow partisans. But voters have the means of rewarding and punishing ideological extremism. And arguably, in the last election, they did just that. The Supreme Court, in the case of New York Times v. Sullivan, that I mentioned before, spoke of an ideal of public speech as, quote, robust and uninhibited. But sometimes I think speech is more robust and more effective if it is inhibited by a hesitancy to insult the opposition, to distort one's opponent's ideas and deride their characters, to suppose their bad faith. It's certainly easier to listen to the other side, in my experience, if it expresses itself with restraint. Turning now to the situation in the universities, I think something different is at issue, at least deep down. Let me introduce this final part of my argument with an image. Suppose you could see only a part of the visual spectrum of colors, say from purple through shades of blue to green. It's not that hard to imagine. One can look through colored glasses and more or less see the world that way. And we know that there's light outside our normal spectrum, infrared and ultraviolet, that we can't see. Now suppose that into this cool world of blues and greens and purples, there suddenly entered orange. Wouldn't we be startled as a deer who suddenly confronts a camouflaged hunter? Perhaps the deer can't see the orange, right? Isn't that why the hunters can wear it, so they see each other, but the deer can't see it? But what if it suddenly could? Perhaps that would be painful. Maybe some viewers would be curious, but wouldn't more seek to avoid it, to flee, to suppress or blot it out, maybe even to deny that it exists. It wouldn't be a color at all, some theoretician might say, but an assault upon true color. It might be dismissed as a disturbance of the eyes. What I want to suggest is that increasingly in the humanities and the social sciences at many universities, and certainly at most liberal arts colleges, the spectrum of views expressed on the faculty is as narrow as my imagined spectrum of colors. Students rarely encounter professors who would describe themselves as conservative, and even professors who are shield their beliefs or bend over backwards to avoid their expression in the classroom or in public. Look at a discipline like sociology, where students take courses on the family, and you'll find that with only a few expressions, the emphasis is on alternative family relationships or criticism of traditional family roles, with studies that find evidence in favor of traditional relationships or arrangements roundly reviewed. Look at history, where structures of exclusion and oppression are discovered and documented, but explanation of achievement and success, at least within the mainstream, is reserved for popular histories, not academic ones. Look at the law, where tenure is awarded for lengthy articles promoting novel ways of turning legal precedents to progressive causes, or sometimes business causes, and traditional law is assumed to be deeply biased. Look even at medicine, where the Hippocratic Oath has to be modified or ignored, as on the frontiers, medicine is no longer just the cure or management of disease, but the redesign of the human body according to the wishes of its inhabitants, and even the elimination of such bodies as are incapable of autonomy. Now let me be clear. I don't mean that there isn't validity to all of these studies, and that some of them are not very well done. For example, a recent book by historian Eric Yellen about Woodrow Wilson's imposition of segregation on the federal civil service and the demotions and indignities of a rising black middle class is an eye-opening book and greatly complicates the story of progressivism in the 20th century. My point, rather, is that the universities in these fields increasingly lean left, and with several harmful consequences. First, students are exposed to only one side of the story, or rather they hear one side taught with rational authority and see the other side only in the form of partisan political expression on the internet, or by Milo, if they could get him to. Sometimes legitimate research on the opposite side is indeed being done by well-trained scholars, but it's often in think tanks, institutions dedicated to research that often have a clear partisan identification, which inevitably colors the results. And their publication outlets are independent of the academic mainstream. Their preferred products are policy proposals rather than scientific articles, and they don't write textbooks. Second, students and potential scholars of these subjects are consequently discouraged by limited career prospects for those who don't adhere to the dominant position. They face permanent minority status in their field should they succeed in getting a job and getting published, and they will watch most of the honors and emoluments of academic life go to others. Third, the whole process is self-reinforcing. If conservatives don't study sociology and history, sociologists and historians increasingly see only part of the spectrum in their fields, and find and themselves lose sight of the viability of alternatives, particularly when the only alternatives they encounter are the crassly partisan. Students of conservative inclination can sense something is wrong, often facing patronizing professors or their own nagging doubts. Of course, there are exceptions, even fields like medieval history where conservatives are gathering and doing creative work. But the overall trend seems to me undeniable. At the very least, the conservative side of the spectrum, at many if not most universities, is weak and faded. The left side, vibrant and invincible. Why were we surprised when the Middlebury students shouted down a conservative speaker who had come to campus? There are only a few conservatives on that faculty, and from my perspective as an alumnus, the administration indicates by what they promote and praise that conservatives would be welcomed as part of the community only grudgingly, if at all. Aren't the students naturally going to see someone like Charles Murray as an alien, bright orange in a field of greens and blues, even without their professors who know better, egging them on? Is there anything that can be done to restore the full spectrum of intellectual life in the universities? One idea that's been pursued is the founding of alternative institutions where conservative rather than liberal values are enshrined into the purpose of the place, and faculty are hired and students recruited accordingly. There's some good achieved in this way, especially when the foundation is not political conservatism, but something more transcendental, perhaps necessarily a religious denomination in church. After all, many of our oldest universities and most of our colleges began as religious seminaries, giving them a dignity beyond mere usefulness. Still, this rather leavens the academic world, taken as a whole, than addresses the problem. For the faculty at such schools cannot and would not want to, if they're good and genuine, enter an alternative scholarly universe. They will and should be at conferences with the rest of us, publish in the same journals and the same presses, or at least sometimes in the same journals and presses, and have one another's books in their libraries. The think tanks have also been helpful sponsors of research, and even though today's universities sometimes appear to be troops of foot soldiers for the Enlightenment, it should be noted that all major Enlightenment thinkers before Adam Smith and Immanuel Kant were, although university trained, working outside of universities, which were then under the patronage and control of the church. Besides, a number of private foundations have been influential in promoting intellectual diversity on campus, including the sponsors of today's talks. I remain confident that thanks to these outside prods and to the generally open and mixed system of funding research and higher education in America, genuine change within the universities is actually possible. So I'm not an advocate of sort of completely separate line of schools. For one thing, although there are ideologues of both liberal and conservative inclination, there are numerous very fine scholars on both sides who do exchange ideas and read and criticize one another's work. I have two suggestions for how the process of tenure and promotion might be altered to facilitate such exchange, and we can talk about those in the question series if you want, question session if you want. It's about not endorsing excessive specialization in different ways. Still, for me, it seems that the case for freedom of speech, in conclusion, is not just a case for respecting the proper limits on licentious speech, or the case for protecting wide freedom for exchange within those limits. It's also the case for encouraging wide-ranging reflection and sustained inquiry into learning in all its dimensions. It requires an appreciation for the vastness of what can be known, humility in respect to how little each one of us can know, and curiosity to know more and to know better. How pitiful, then, that students at a school like Middlebury, who are now my fellow alumni of that school, given the privilege of a few years of study, haven't seen the world in all the colors of the spectrum. Taught to view things only through the politics of identity, they overlook that college is about learning to see through the limits of identity, to encounter, especially through books, minds very different from one's own, and in a good curriculum of great variety over time and space, and yes, ethnicity and ideology and faith. W.E.B. Du Bois, whom I mentioned earlier, of course, who did some of this seminal work here in Atlanta, wrote movingly in his beautiful book, On the Souls of Blackfoot, how in reading Shakespeare and other great writers, he could dwell, as he put it, quote, above the veil of color that otherwise would have oppressed him in segregated America. I suppose it would be misinterpreted to accuse contemporary academics and the students they indoctrinate of hiding behind the veil. But I do think the question of freedom of speech, considered in its full meaning, requires us to rise above not only our prejudices, but our theories, and not only our backgrounds, but our cohorts. This is the true task of the university, and while I don't believe that that alone will adequately address the deep fractures in our polity, I do think that universities so dedicated will help produce the men and women who can. Thank you.
Well, if only we were in church, I could just shout amen and take my seat. But I can't get away with that here. I want to say that Jim Stoner's talk is so rich, it's impossible to say anything that was substantive about it in a few minutes. I think the theme might be compressed into this question, though. What is freedom for? We tend to emphasize the right to freedom and the right to freedom of speech as if that's the end of the matter. What Jim proposes is that attention to the end of speech clarifies the right, is crucial to defining it, and to define is precisely to show what its limits are. And as he notes, this famous thinker, Isaiah Berlin, who had the record, by the way, for being the fastest talking philosopher on the planet. I'll try and emulate him. Berlin distinguished between negative freedom and positive freedom. Negative freedom is freedom from. Positive freedom, he said, was freedom for. And so you can see how positive freedom of speech points to something beyond itself. Free speech, as Jim described it, seems to be for truth, and truth without quotation marks. He refers briefly to John Stuart Mill's famous notion that the truth will emerge if we permit the collision of opinions, just as the competition of products brings progress. I just learned the other day the iPhone 10 is here. The competition of ideas similarly winnows errors and refines truth. Even manifestly false ideas deserve a hearing, according to Mill, because the contrast of truth with error makes the truth more vivid to us. This scheme has considerable merit, but it also has, I think, an embarrassing liability. In athletic competition, as we know, the weaker teams are eliminated in the process. The Packers and Seahawks go, the Broncos and the Steelers are left behind, and only the Patriots and the Falcons remain standing. And then, as Mill predicted, the superior team emerges. Too soon? But in intellectual competition, losing ideas never seem to be driven from the field. They can show up again and again, and they really tend to do that in the public square. Mill was a believer in intellectual progress and seemed to think that even people of bad faith could play a role in it. Jim Stoner, I think, is less sanguine about that, and so he insists, interestingly, on the requirement of sincerity. His point seems to be that a genuine respect for truth itself is needed, and not merely confidence that the marketplace of ideas will somehow do its thing. Think of how we are supposed to sign off in letters. We never write letters formally anymore, but you know how we're supposed to do it. We end with sincerely yours, respectfully yours truly. I suggest a litmus test for the genuineness of blogs and essays and tweets. Can you imagine such a valediction below that message? If not, it's probably a sign that passions are being vented rather than arguments offered. And this brings me to Jim's second point. He says, there is a place for passion. I quote, but it's only provisional or initial. The beginning point of an argument, an attempt to wake up the complacent, perhaps. This is a very powerful point. And so too is his assertion that justice must be a part of the exercise of free speech rights. I'll make 2 quick points about that. He's quasi-serious about banning the F word, imposing fines, and no exemption for faculty. Today, you could fund a nice new Gothic athletic facility at Oglethorpe with that money, right? The ban would also, however, be the death of stand-up comedy. It would also make it impossible for Anthony Scaramucci to join his pal Sean Spicer at Harvard University. But I think stand-up comedy might go and something better could be reborn in the process, but I fear our culture is really too far gone. And reviving the informal norms and the social sanctions that used to keep profanity within some bounds is probably not a prospect for us anymore. The N-word should also go, and that's not at all implausible. And Jim makes a strong case here, but interestingly, he cleaves to the traditional legal distinction between expressing a derogatory, a general derogatory opinion and a targeted insult that strikes directly and immediately at a person's dignity. As he's aware, there are new theorists today who want to resurrect the concept of group defamation or group libel, and they call it now a harm to dignity or a dignitarian harm. The reasoning is close to what it was in an old Supreme Court case where that harm was given credence. And the court in that case, Beauharnais versus Illinois, convicting a white supremacist for distributing his stupid leaflet, held this: if an utterance directed at an individual may be the object of criminal sanctions, then no good reason appears to deny a state the power to punish the same utterances when they are directed at a defined group. Now, Jim is a leading scholar of law, and he knows the Beauharnais decision has really not played any further subsequent role in our jurisprudence. But isn't there an impressive coherence to that passage, to that argument I just quoted, denying the individual versus the group distinction? Those on the receiving end of group defamation don't seem to appreciate that distinction. And I wonder what he thinks about the new effort by people like Jeremy Waldron to resurrect that idea. I'll have to leave it up to others to take up Jim's provocative argument for protecting vulnerable souls from corruption, not least because I tend to agree with it, but the challenges there are even greater. So finally, his point about what he calls the narrow spectrum of color reminds us quite intentionally of another image, Socrates' cave in the Republic. Jim points the finger at identity politics, which he thinks has disastrous consequences for free speech and education generally. Of course, the argument for those passionate concerns is typically framed as a demand for justice, although the words that are used these days tend to be diversity and inclusion. So another question I have is, why isn't this assertion of justice as worthy of incorporation with those others that he mentioned in the first part of his talk. I'll close by suggesting that we do, in fact, need to refocus on justice in higher education, but not for the sake of preventing or punishing dignitarian harms. And here I think I'm just elaborating something that Jim already said in his talk, but not quite putting it this way. There's a familiar complaint of academics. You haven't done justice to my argument. Every issue of the New York Review of Books contains a long section of letters to the editor which consists of nothing other than this complaint. But the words are very revealing, instructive. In academic life, justice is owed first, foremost, and finally to the argument, to the logos, if you will. It's another way, to be sure, of referring to our concern for truth, but notice, there is a real moral virtue associated with it, the virtue of justice. And if we made justice our virtue in this sense, I think we might accomplish all that Jim hopes for and sketches in the second part of his talk, in that we might reduce harms to dignity in the process without specifically aiming at them. It would mean that we students would owe and show each other mutual respect, not because of our unchosen identities, but insofar as our arguments were sincere attempts to clarify the truth of things. Our discussions would remain heated. To discuss literally means to break something violently, so you can get the little pieces and see better what it's all about. Our passionate challenges to one another would not end, but perhaps they would have this unspoken preface behind them. I don't insist that you're evil. I merely think you're mistaken. Thank you.
Hello. Very glad to be here at Oglethorpe and to have the occasion to read and respond to Professor Stoner's remarks. I wish to first agree with what I take to be the main thrust of his talk. And then I want to follow the example that I think he puts on the table for us to make a criticism, or at least perhaps an addition, a necessary supplement to what he's saying. He urges us, if I understand him correctly, that we don't really have a speech problem. If I understand what he's saying, it's not that our problem is that either there is speech that should be protected that is not currently being protected, either by the government or on university campuses. And it's not that there is speech that shouldn't be protected that is currently having free rein. Now, he quibbles on the margins with this, but if I understand him correctly, he's saying that we don't so much have a free speech problem as a listening problem. That we have an abundance of diverse political opinions that are freely expressed in this country, that we enjoy freedom of speech largely, in the sense that we should enjoy it, but that we don't listen to the various speech that we have available to us. That when we are confronted with an opinion that we find politically or morally repulsive, we can respond in only two ways. Either the person who's saying this is evil, they are nefarious, they mean ill against me or somebody else, or they have no idea what they're talking about. They're totally uninformed. They're ignorant. Perhaps they have a low IQ, but this can be our only response when we hear an opinion that we disagree with. We assume that the person who voted for the other candidate or has the opposite view on any particular issue, that they could not have arrived at their position honestly. they could only have come to this view through bad intentions or because they have no idea what they're talking about. They don't read the paper. Conservatives, or too many conservatives, assume that liberals favor more social spending because they're naively idealistic. They have no sense of what is possible. Too many liberals assume that whomever votes for Republicans must hate people of color or want to keep them down, but that's the only possible motivation that they could have. Of course, it's always possible that people hold their opinions because they hold hatred in their heart or because they really have no idea what they're talking about. This is possible, but it's usually not the reason. At least in some cases, it's not the reason. If that were the case, then 50% of this country is stupid and uninformed, because 50% thinks that of the other side, and vice versa. And it's probably not the case that 50% of the country meets that description. I think that he encourages us to quote him, try honestly to see how the other sees things, what he or she fears, hopes, knows, and believes, not supposing at the outset that their opponents are simply deluded or irrational, but that they just might have a point, or that they've come by their position honestly. I wholeheartedly agree that we should have this intention. I just want to acknowledge, though, that this is very difficult to do. It is extremely difficult. It takes tremendous courage and self-control, especially in the heat of and the wake of the recent presidential election, to listen to somebody who voted for the other candidate explain why they did so. To be able to sit through it with a straight face and to try to understand what they're saying, that is not a small act of heroism. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. I think we should, but I just want to note that it's difficult. And I think, and I want to state at the end of my comments here, why painful as it often is, we should make ourselves suffer through conversations we don't want to hear, or at least listen to them on the radio station we don't usually listen to, or on the television program we don't usually watch. But first, I want to apply the advice that he gives us to try to understand what could possibly legitimately be motivating the other position. I want to apply this advice, this example, to the group that he criticizes at the end of his talk. Academics, university professors. There's a few in this group. He criticizes the professoriate for, by and large, allowing itself to become a sort of left-wing ideological camp. To have a tent that is big enough, perhaps, to encompass Marxist-leaning liberals, Marxist-leaning leftists, and market-oriented people on the left, and even, I should say, libertarians. That's big enough to welcome scholars studying English, Spanish, Chinese, Arabic languages and cultures, but not big enough to welcome, even if it does tolerate, political conservatives, and I would say especially social conservatives, religious persons, or scholars whose social science examines causal factors that they don't want to consider. For example, who examine the role of family instability or some kind of cultural factor in exacerbating American politics. So I'm going to use the pronoun they here, just because in this context where I'm considering the other as being the professors, even though neither we nor they I feel is the right pronoun for me to use. So this is my sense of what they're thinking, and if others may wish to add or suggest corrections to what I say. My sense is that many faculty view themselves as doing exactly what Professor Stoner argues that we all should be doing, which is to say, presenting and listening to the other side. They believe that they should prod students to consider perspectives that they have not been exposed to or ever had to seriously weigh. in their lives in the world outside the university, where their family and friends are not, by and large, liberal intellectuals. When they look at the broader American social, economic, and political order, when the professoriate, they see a widening gap between the rich and the poor, within races as much as between them. And they worry that students, at least those who haven't directly experienced such poverty, simply cannot understand what the desperation that people feel who do endure desperate circumstances. And they think that students should learn about peoples who live on a different part of the economic ladder and learn how to sympathize with them, to see things from their point of view. They observe that African American and Latino men are more likely than whites to be stopped and questioned by the police. And that in general, the outcomes for people of color, both sexes, tend to be worse in terms of prospects for going up the economic ladder, for graduating from college, even enjoying good health. They observe these things, and they think that students should learn about the experiences of such people, hear clearly their points of view, their grievances, and seek a more just future, where the US lives up to the principles that I think across the political spectrum we still hold dear, that we are all created equal and all endowed with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They see photographs of the president holding a meeting in the Oval Office to discuss women's health care, where 100% of the participants are men. And they fear that something like the bad old days of discounting the perspectives of half of the country's citizens are back. And so they want students to see what they see, and yes, I think, to be outraged by it. They want students to leave the university ready to make their communities more just places. In short, I think, especially in the wake of recent elections, I think that left-leaning faculty, which many studies show, in fact, do predominate, although it varies by discipline and by region, geographic region. In short, I think these faculty see themselves as a sort of stronghold for a counter-narrative to broader American society. They view themselves as challenging the conventional wisdom on the outside, exposing students to points of view they haven't really considered. Now, are they right in their assumptions about the beliefs that students come in with? Are they right that the bad outcomes that they observe among minorities and poor Americans, that these come primarily from systemic injustices, that they come from a culture dominated by rich white men? I don't assume for a moment that the answer is definitely yes or no to those questions. I would say I tend to assume that I have no idea where students are coming from when they show up in my classroom. But for the sake of argument, let's say they are right about everything. For the sake of argument, let's say they're right about everything. If they are, then I want to suggest why it is still imperative that students hear arguments that totally conflict with these views. To put it in more concrete terms, even if what I've sketched out as the view of the professors he's criticizing is right, I still think it's important that they read texts that make the case for the traditional family, that praise the extraordinary accomplishments of the United States, even the case for tax cuts for the wealthy. I think it's important that they read these things. Things that make the case against affirmative action. I want to suggest a more practical reason, perhaps even a strategic reason, that I would make to a professor who sympathizes with what I suggested, or agrees with what I suggested as the way that professors tend to see things. Which is that Oglethorpe students, like any college students, will eventually go back into the real world. Many of them go back in the real world every night if they live at home. Many of them go back there every weekend. They certainly go back there on holidays. And they talk with their family and friends who have opinions that are different from them, that are not those that they are necessarily learning about in college or that they heard when they were growing up. And when they are not compelled to confront arguments which they profoundly disagree with which they find repulsive, I think that a certain part of our intellect remains primitive and undeveloped. Or perhaps it atrophies. I would say most college students at some point all of us at some point will question some opinion that we grew up having. But if we don't continue to question even after we've made one discovery, then that part of our intellect atrophies. And the consequence is that whenever we do confront somebody who is an intelligent, well-read proponent of a view we disagree with, we become paralyzed, we become mute, we sound like fools. If we have never confronted and had to contend with somebody who makes an intelligent, well-informed case for the position we reject with all of our hearts. We find ourselves doing what he says we do too often, which is to accuse the other person of just acting with bad intentions, with having hatred in their heart, or with being dumb, or just not knowing anything. So I think that this applies to all of us, regardless of our political leanings, that we should be worried that that part of our intellect that can defend its positions could become atrophied. But I would say that it does have a special significance if we consider the possibility, and I think the likelihood that what he's saying is true about the limited colors of the political spectrum in most departments on most college campuses. There are many studies of the partisan affiliations and ideological leanings of faculty members by many different institutions. You can look at the Higher Education Research Institute, for example. So what this means is that there is a danger that only the conservative students are spending their college days honing their skills of defense. And that students who support Democrats and liberals are going to go out into the world not having had to hone those skills and are going to be severely disadvantaged. So that is in addition to the philosophic arguments, my sort of strategic argument for making yourself listen to NPR, WSB Radio, Pacifica, whichever one you don't usually listen to it. Because if you don't, you will not be able to defend the values that you hold dear. All right.
Swearing is out, huh? Justin? There's actually some research indicating that swearing correlates with an extremely high vocabulary. If that's true, I should be the Shakespeare of our times. I'm not a constitutional lawyer or a scholar. I'm a philosopher. So I'm not really going to ask what's in the Constitution, but rather what should be in the Constitution. Nonetheless, I think that some jurisprudence might be helpful, and besides, the Constitution is interpretively loose, and any interpretation will necessarily be guided by ideological reasons. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. So these remarks actually are more than simply indirectly about the Constitution, I hope. What I want to do today is look at the justification for free speech. Dr. Stoner looked at the ends of free speech, and I think it's kind of analogous to look at the justifications for it. Don't get me wrong here. I've benefited more than most from free speech. I'm a big fan, but I would like a really solid justification, and sadly I'm rather pessimistic about the current state of play. There seem to me to be two arguments traceable to the same source, John Stuart Mill. The first is an argument from his harm principle, which is the only purpose for which power can rightfully be exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. That's sort of like the classical analysis or the classical justification for free speech. Free speech causes no harm, QED, it must not be abridged. It seems to me that the clear problem here is that the harm principle itself is in need of some justification. And as Dr. Stoner and others have pointed out, some speech, in fact, maybe much speech, for example, pornography, although I would have gone with hate speech. I would have thought that the hate speech was a more clear case where pornography was somewhat contentious. Anyway. So I view the whole harm principle thing as, if not a non-starter, an extremely contentious defense, and I'm not really going to go there. The other justification is taken from John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, Part 2, right at the beginning. It's page 31. But the peculiar evil of silencing the expression of an opinion is that it is robbing the human race, posterity as well as existing generations, those who dissent from the opinion still more than those who hold it. If the opinion is right, they are deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. If wrong, they lose what is almost as great a benefit, the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth produced by its collision with error, which Dr. Cullen gave that quote earlier, the collision with error. This line of reasoning is also present in John Milton's Arithmetica, classically. The line of reasoning is traced through U.S. jurisprudence, through Oliver Wendell Holmes' opinion in Abrams v. U.S. Kind of ironically, the first time this actually appears, and the first time we get the metaphor of the marketplace of ideas, it's in a dissenting opinion, which means people didn't buy it. It succeeds in 1953 in U.S. v. Rumley, and in 1969 versus Brandenburg versus Ohio. And now it's just sort of like, as far as I can tell, settled jurisprudence. It's kind of strange that this cherished principle only takes hold about 70 years ago, huh? At any rate, these cases introduce the term marketplace of ideas, and I'm pretty sure that that is the only extant argument for free speech or free speech absolutism. It's worth noting straight away that this is a consequentialist argument. It justifies free speech on the basis of its consequences. And I think the worry with all such arguments is that we may have misjudged what those consequences actually are. It's, after all, an empirical question whether Mill's benefits accrue to free speech and only free speech. So what exactly are the putative benefits? First, if a censored idea is true, we never get a chance to correct it. Second, if it's false, we are denied the chance to test it and see how well it holds up. So I'll add some more. Third, the robust exchange of ideas via free speech will result in the truth coming to light. This is what we get out of the marketplace of ideas metaphor. And finally, the exposure of false ideas will cause them to be discarded. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. But are these in fact genuine consequences, or are they circumscribed in some way or another? So let's start out with the exposure of false ideas. Does this usually result in their being discarded? Again, that's an empirical question, and I'm aware of no empirical research on the matter. But it's pretty easy to imagine false or harmful ideas being widely accepted, isn't it? Perhaps the proponent of these false ideas is a particularly skilled orator. Perhaps people are naturally inclined to err in that way. And we do have plenty of empirical studies showing the ways in which human beings naturally err. I don't think we have to get that imaginative either. Look at America today. No matter which side you are on, about half of Americans have false and perhaps dangerous beliefs. I leave it to you to decide which side that is. Moreover, and this seems pretty well researched and indisputed, if there are just too many false ideas out there, repeated loudly and often enough, and people simply give up on even reputable sources. Right? This is the plague of fake news. And we have plenty of evidence and research that there were willfully false ideas being widely disseminated in the last election, perhaps by foreign governments, and that the result was, in fact, that people just stopped trusting the news entirely. So it seems to me that constant repetition of false or harmful ideas may result in their becoming normalized. I rather fear that many thoughts that were unspeakably vile and just unspeakable even 5 years ago are considered acceptable today. Overt racism and anti-Semitism seem to me to be, if not accepted, sadly tolerated. And seeing these ideas in the open emboldens many to feel more secure in holding them. Some molds and bacteria actually grow in sunlight. So does the robust exchange of ideas result in truth coming to light? I think the same considerations apply here. People err in natural ways. The skill of the orator is relevant, and many people may have vested interests in preserving the false. It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. It's Upton Sinclair from The Jungle, is that? So is it the case that false ideas will lead to the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth produced by its collision with error? This too seems dubious to me. I'm sure my students will be the first to say that even their true beliefs now seem rather confused and much less clear and lively, now that they've been exposed to a lot of philosophy. That's our job. We kick up dust and then complain that we can't see. Isn't that really the purpose of skepticism? You posit a situation you know to be false. For example, an evil demon is deceiving you. Suddenly your beliefs about tables and chairs, so clearly correct a minute ago, seem unjustified and confused, not clearer and livelier. Again, sophists might use clever rhetoric to confuse people in even their justified beliefs. Many people may have reasons and vested interests in covering up the truth. I'm thinking in particular of tobacco companies and smoking research. So far, all the supposed benefits of free speech seem rather questionable to me, or at least highly circumscribed. Perhaps speech does have these beneficial consequences, perhaps not, but the matter is far from clear, and there are many reasons why speech should not have these consequences. At the very least, the benefits of speech seem to have boundaries and limits, and if that's so, speech itself should have boundaries and limits. So those claims were all to the effect that free speech is a sufficient condition for various benefits. Mill's original defense, I think, is a little bit cagier. His first argument, it appears to me, is that free speech is a necessary condition for a certain benefit. For example, if speech is censored, then unless the censors are infallible, a condition we need not take seriously, right? Unless the censors are infallible, we will be unable to use true censored beliefs to correct false common beliefs. So free speech is necessary for error correction, if not sufficient. It might even be so if free speech was no guarantee of error correction. So this seems like the best shot to me for a consequentialist theory. Is free speech really a necessary condition of error correction now? Well, it's possible that no true idea gets censored. Highly unlikely. Everything I've said about speakers holds true for censors as well. They might be motivated to cover up the truth by either vested interests or natural human propensities to error. They may have been swayed by casuistry. And in all probability, they're simply wrong in some cases. I've only met one person who was right all the time. I used to be arrogant, but now I'm perfect. But still, we really require free speech for error correction.